Hello, my name is Dawn. I am the owner of Hungry Heart Quests and host for the Hungry Heart Quests podcast. With me today is Ben Hanawalt, owner of SomaSmith and board-certified Structural Integrator.
Well, I'm really glad that I haven't had to build a resume in almost 15 years because after all this time in practice, I'm pretty sure I'm unemployable. But yeah, I have, man, it's so hard. Once again, trying to make a long story short, I found structural integration because it was the only thing that helped the chronic pain that I was experiencing. Actually, during my blacksmithing apprenticeship. And I was in a lot of pain, and I had started practicing Tai Chi, was doing yoga, and I found that they kept me going, but the same problems kept coming up. And it wasn't until I went to get some more books at the Bozeman Library, because I was at Big Timber at the time, and found a 3x5 note card that said Bodywork will trade for firewood. And I was like, I can get firewood. And turned out she practiced structural integration, and within just, I want to say 2 or 3 sessions, my body was very, very different. And especially at that point in my life, I was very cerebral, skeptic, conservative. And went to go ride my horse and had the saddle, got up in the saddle, and the stirrups were wrong. Like, one stirrup was too short, and went and readjusted, counted the holes, and realized that I think I'd had that saddle for 10 years, my right leg had been at least 1.5 inches shorter than the left. And all of a sudden, it wasn't, and my stirrups were equal, and that felt good, and I was like, something happened.
That's wild that you noticed that big of a difference, first off, and really cool that you were able to see it so visually, like that it was measurable.
Yeah, and that, I think that realization changed my life, and that's when I started studying structural integration, and since then I've written multiple papers on Dr. Rolf's work, trained with as many of her students as I could find while they were still alive, because she died in 1979, so even before I was born. And have taught the basic trainings of structural integration since then, and truly that's one of the things I'm most proud of. So if I had to make a resume, God forbid, those would be the things that I'd note.
Mm-hmm. But those, as we were talking before we started all of this, are not really the meat of the story. We have all of this experience behind us that contributes to where we are now. And I know, having had some conversations with you, that all of your experience in structural integration has altered how you perform your work and how you think about your work. And you were telling me how it's a language and a philosophy, and you've gone down the rabbit hole in the best way, maybe. But where did it all start?
There I was, 3 years old, in a corral with my dad. Big old cow had just given birth, and I thought I could help. And that mama cow was not impressed with this little human being and proceeded to try to stomp the life out of me.
Really?
Fortunately, she still had horns, so she had me pinned up against the barn.
Wow.
But her horns kept her head from crushing me. That's probably where it started.
Well, that's somewhat terrifying, and I'm sure that had a major impact on you. Even if you, I don't know, do you remember that experience? You were pretty young.
I do. trigger warning, I remember bleeding out of my ears and being very scared.
Yeah.
It's hard to say where it all began. It's easier for me to think about it retrospectively. How all these different things led to where I am now in a way that when I look back, I'm like, oh my gosh, like I was training for this my entire life, and this experience and that experience, and like even hunting and butchering and processing wild game. Mm-hmm. Like I look back at that and I'm like, I couldn't have had a better foundation in anatomy. I've done human dissections in a lab, but honestly I feel like those early experiences taught me so much about more about what a living body and not living but closer. It's the agents that they use to stabilize a body after death changes drastically the tissues within the body. Mm-hmm. And so those experiences of butchering my own animals and gave me an incredible understanding in terms of like tendons are incredibly strong. Like there's no way that you can with your own hands like tear a muscle off the bone. Like
well, it's interesting because I studied anatomy as well, and so I have similar experience of the difference between what people are taught in anatomy class to be human tissue and what is living tissue. And they are if you ever work on a cadaver, it is not anything like living tissue. And having done plenty of butchering of animals myself, I have found that to be extremely educational on the finer notes in a way, like the subtler things that we learn about the body that we don't think about in kind of big academy anatomy.
It's true. I would say that processing your own game, wouldn't it be so easy if you could just be like, oh, here's a triceps and I'll put that in the bag, and oh, here's the biceps and I'll put that in a bag. It's like, oh no, you gotta work for that.
Yeah, absolutely.
And there isn't that kind of differentiation in reality. And one of my anatomy teachers, he had the analogy that what we call muscles are basically the same as zip codes. Like they don't actually exist in any real way, but they're very useful when you're trying to specify where on the map something is located.
That's an interesting thought. I'm already zooming in even further, thinking about like cellular level and how different muscle fibers will group and things like that. So I could imagine like it being a little neighborhood, and then there's certain neighbors that get along really well. There's certain avenues that have better traffic, like better road systems, and
oh my goodness, it's so true. I've thought about that recently because my office is located on Rouse, and there was, I want to say, 3 years there where Rouse was under major construction. And it had been my main easiest way to get to work, and all of a sudden I had to like zigzag through the different neighborhoods and like travel. And I was thinking about that, and it's like so much of what I experience when I'm working with people is very much like parts and aspects of their body were put under road construction, and so their movements had to go through a much less efficient route to do the same thing. And the life process is amazing in the sense that we're always healing, always. That's what life does. And even when people are fully healed, and this is what really got me thinking about this, is one day I was driving to work after Rouse had been completed, And I wasn't really thinking about it, and I started to zigzag through the backwoods again, or the back neighborhood, because it was so habitual to drive that way after those years that I forgot that there was an easier way that I could go, and I had to really like
relearn, unlearn.
Yeah, and I feel like movement patterns are very similar even after an accident's healed. We can still be using our compensatory movement patterns even if we don't have to, because it's habit.
I had two thoughts on that. One, that maintaining those inefficient habits can lead to re-injury or new injury. And also that, at least in the analogy of road construction, once we figure out that we can drive the route that we are normally going to be taking again, we can switch back to that. But when it comes to the body, the unlearning and the relearning poses one of the biggest challenges to people in healing. And I like that you say that we're always healing, because it's absolutely true. And I think a lot of people don't realize that their own bodies are the ones doing the healing, not the people. I mean, there are certainly people who help with the healing and help get everything talking again, but it's still their body doing the work in a lot of ways.
Amen. I feel like my job isn't to do something to a person. It's to listen to and touch in to their body's healing process, and quite literally give it a hand. Like, oh, there you go, that thoracic vertebra derotated. Yeah, now you can do your thing. And I like that, because it's...
So the listening, is that where you kind of started to learn that that structural integration is a language? Is it the listening, or is it the feedback through touch? How did you come to view it as a language?
Well, I would like to dedicate that particular lesson to my horse Shen.
Oh.
Who's just turned 20, and taught me how to listen, and the language of touch. Because one of the things that he taught me through horsemanship, and that's one of the things I'm very grateful for, is that it is a touch-based language. And so when I'm riding a horse, like, I might say things, but those are mostly just for me to help me focus my thoughts. It's my shift in my body and communicating through my stance and my posture and that relationship. That is where the true dance occurs. And horses are very much, I think, like most living beings, they don't particularly like to be lectured or yelled at. They really appreciate an easy flow of communication. And so as we worked together over the last 20 years, the more I was able to listen, even if it was a behavior that I might say is like bad, like throwing his head or balking at some shadow, the more I was able to really listen and accept, or be curious. Basically, like, what do you say there? The more our relationship refined, and we were able to do more things, more like a dance, which I think you probably have more experience than I do on that. But
well, a lot of what you're saying makes me think about if people were able to tune in that way to each other, because you can absolutely have that kind of communication with another human, believe it or not, how different the world would be, and then put them into bodies that work well for them, and like, what happens then? And
Truly.
I love the story of the horse. One, I love horses because I grew up neighboring some grazing pasture land and like 5,000 acres of state land that was like nothing out there. And a lot of the neighbors had horses, and I would love to just be around them, and I would like sing to them, and I would just like go and hang out. And I always felt like those beings could never be appreciated enough in a lot of ways. And I would guess that that's partly my sense of that came because they weren't listened to, right? And they weren't maybe cared for in the best way that they could have been. And I love hearing about the connection between you and your horse because it's beautiful. And it seems to have taught you a lot.
I have to put him right there on my list of greatest teachers. Another thing that he taught me that I've utilized consistently is it's like horses, and maybe this is all animals, but my experience with horses is that they are masters of the nervous system. Like their nervous system is so fine-tuned that I don't even know how to describe that. How I recognized it and what I did with it was because I did have the opportunity to train him from, I think he was not a year old and just living with horses at the time, so from pretty much scratch. And there was one time that we were just starting the saddling process of like what it is to wear a saddle. And you had mentioned earlier about how squeezing can feel comforting, but it can also feel claustrophobic. And I think for horses, claustrophobia is the like primary response. So to have something strapped around them triggers pretty significant nervous system response in terms of like danger, which is often why they try to throw it off like they would a bobcat or another predator. And so I was going through this process and I felt anxious. And I grew up training horses with my dad, so this was something I was very comfortable with. And in that moment I realized, like, wait a minute, I'm not feeling anxious, he's feeling anxious, and therefore I'm feeling anxious. And once that recognition occurred, I started playing with that more and more. So like even today when I work with a client, like the first thing I'll do is just sit with myself and establish a baseline of how I'm feeling in that moment, so that when a client comes in, any changes in how I'm feeling I can record as information in terms of what I'm picking up from their nervous system. And it can be wild, even in terms of like, I remember once I'm working with a woman, she comes in and I started getting this tingling behind my shoulder blade. And I was like, wait a minute, I didn't have this tingling. And got to working, and we found that one of the nerve branches had become adhered to a rib. And I didn't realize it at the time, but it was one of her primary things that she'd been working with following a severe car accident, was this nerve pain. And it was like, whoa. Yeah. So another interesting thing that I learned from my horse.
And back to the dance side of that, I've watched some horsemanship videos, and it's absolutely interesting to see, like, you can watch somebody on their horse, somebody that they've been working, somebody being the horse that they've been working with for a long time, and they don't have to do anything obvious or aggressive. It can be so subtle.
So subtle.
And last night I was teaching a dance lesson, and one of the main focuses of the lesson last night was compression. And I say compression, I mean like it as an aspect of connection. Because when you
kind of that leaning into each other.
Yeah, exactly. So we did a lot of like holding hands and pressing together and pressing apart. And we were essentially training these students to tune into their own bodies in understanding the sense that needs to happen in order to communicate to your partner and for them to communicate to you. And I was talking to Jack about it last night because he came to the lesson series, and he said that it was like Tai Chi in that having a frame for the dance isn't so much about you having frame. It's about being able to almost reach into that other person and understand their frame. It was a fascinating perspective. I was like, oh, and that's kind of how I'm imagining this language and this communication happening between bodies, is that you know where you are, but you can also be there and pick up on what's happening in the other person's body and then make adjustments that way.
Amen. And it's a high level skill. I would say it's even more difficult than rubbing your tummy and chewing gum at the same time.
Oh, I absolutely agree. Like, having taught a lot of dancers, I'm like, okay, a lot of people they're not in touch with how fine-tuned an instrument that they are. And they don't listen in that way. And so so much of their ability to tell if something is wrong with their body or if something is right with their body or with somebody they're interacting with, they just don't have the skill because they haven't paid attention for so long or were never taught to pay attention. And so I'm doing this with dancing, but I'm sure that this is some component of just helping people to be in a state of listening to their own bodies better. It takes some time.
It absolutely does. And I know that it was very difficult for me because I found I always needed to like take the sensation, turn it into a mental concept, make a plan around that, and then move with that, which is a really slow process.
And lots of translation, right? A lot could be lost in translation.
And I know, in like really efficient horsemanship, and this happens, I mean, in martial arts, I'm sure in dancing, riding horses, it's like if you're in motion and you have to think about it, you've already missed the boat. It's like you're already a beat behind, and like
yeah, absolutely. With dancing, that's one of the things we also talked about last night, was that when you have, at least for the concept of dancing, when we were teaching technique, that's one of the focuses of this lesson series. And when you have that technique and good form and making sure that you're not throwing your shoulder out of joint trying to like do this move or something, it's like when you have all of that and you know how to move your body just inherently, then you don't have to think about moving. You can just enjoy the dance.
I dream of that moment in my own life.
In dancing or in martial arts? Or
well, I would really like to be I would really like to reach that level of skill in dance. I'm definitely the dancer who is like doing and then all of a sudden stops to try to figure out how to do that spin, which, you know, interrupts the dance quite a bit as the wheel in my head starts turning. But on my list. Yeah.
So I'm curious about your blacksmithing history, because I assume that it played a role in picking the name for your work or for your business as SomaSmith. You know, it does seem to be connected.
Yes. blacksmithing, when I look back on blacksmithing, it is another one of those formative experiences that gave me a lot of transferable skills. And one of those is this blacksmithing principle must go back to, the beginning of the Iron Age, but the idea that there's no use pounding on cold steel. And steel is amazing in the fact that you can take a piece of steel that's been properly heat treated, and it's a spring. It will bend with, absorb all the force you put into it, and be able to bounce back into shape and release all that stored energy. Almost. There's very little loss of energy in that. However, if you heat it up to a high enough temperature, the crystalline structure actually breaks down in such a way that the carbon migrates away from the corners of the crystal.
That's how it strengthens the blade, or is it has that how it becomes flexible?
It's how it becomes malleable. Okay. So, and how it becomes hardened. So, it's basically a bunch of square blocks, and the carbon forms at the corners, so it keeps them from sliding across each other.
Right.
And that's a hardened steel, like a blade. So when you heat it up enough, the carbon and the molecules change shape so that the individual atoms can have free movement, and then all of a sudden you can bend a piece of steel with your hands that you couldn't have bent with a 50-pound sledge. And so when I'm working with people, that's my first thought is, okay, so we've got some tissue here, it's stuck. How do we get it to that state where it can move again? And so that's partly where SomaSmith comes from, is just all those understandings of how to work with steel. A fascinating thing to know is that our connective tissue has basically the same statistics as spring steel, in the sense of being able to absorb kinetic energy and release it without damaging the internal structure.
That's so cool. You made me like my body 10 times more immediately just by saying that.
We're spring loaded. It's not just Tigger. We are literally spring loaded. And I find that pretty awe-inspiring. So when I was coming up with a business name, there's just a lot of, even the word smith, I think is so fascinating because it basically means a maker. So you could be a tinsmith, you could be a coppersmith, you could be a silversmith, you could be a goldsmith, you could be a wordsmith, you could be a locksmith. And I was like, well, what about a SomaSmith?
Love it.
And often when people ask me, so what exactly is that? One of my favorite replies is to be like, well, it's basically locksmithing for a body. Have you ever been locked out of your car? Well, some people get locked out of their psoas. Some people get locked out of their cervicals. Call the locksmith.
Yeah. Wow, that's really interesting. I appreciate so it's interesting for me, having had a session with you, to think about how that might translate into my experience being on the table. Because the smithing analogy of heating the steel, I've actually watched a lot of Instagram videos of this.
Cool.
Because I have a friend who's a bladesmith.
Oh, yeah.
And over in Paradise Valley. And he posts these videos of making lots of different things. But it's always just, you can watch it forever, and it's so satisfying to watch this process. But it always looks like it takes a lot of energy to heat something up. These things are glowing, they're I would never, you'd melt if you touched it, right? And yes. The subtlety of your work is so easeful in a way, or it felt very easeful, but I experienced the becoming more mobile. And so when I think about like, oh, okay, like getting the body to that point seems like it would take a lot of energy, but when I worked with you, what you worked on with me was very gentle and easeful, and it didn't have this like jarring power. It was much more like smooth flowing in a way, more like molecules sliding more easily over each other. Yeah.
I don't have an answer for that. There are so many different types of energy. Like heat is a type of energy. So when I rub my hands together, I can use that friction to create heat, but my hands don't melt or
thank goodness
slough off. Yeah, I suspect because very often people sometimes they feel surprisingly tired after a session. And they're like, but I was just laying there. And you did, like you say, you weren't even really doing that much. And it's like, I'm going to go home and take a nap. And so I do think that most of the energy actually comes from inside a person, or potentially like, I don't think it's like using up their chi, but like energetic, universal energy. Like I do feel like there is a energy flow that's happening, and not primarily from pressure or friction. And I think it's informational, that energy. One of the things I like to say, because people often, especially if they've heard of Ralphie, and think it's,
yeah,
and are almost always surprised that it doesn't take that. And because in my experience, it's not the pressure that makes the change. It's the information that the pressure conveys. And so, yeah, I suspect there's like utilizing a larger energy field is actually part of it. And Dr. Rolf, like her big thing was gravity. Like we are a small energy field in a much larger energy field. And so her conceptualization of Rolfian and structural integration was the idea that we can utilize that greater energy field if we are in alignment with it. And so I don't know if that
yeah, no, I mean, having watched plenty of videos and seen Jack on the floor, like on the mat with martial artists, it's like this, they're tapping into something different in terms of how they can create force with like less of their own energy in a lot of ways. So we could go
oh my
into
goodness. But yeah, I think it is redirecting some sort of bigger force in a very precise way.
Yeah.
So very much like internal martial arts, but
yeah. And one of the things that I've thought a little bit about with bodywork is that a lot of people go and they're just like, I'm not doing much, I'm just laying on the table. And so they just lay on the table. But when I was working with you, I was like, no, I'm very engaged in every part of this. Like my body is relaxed and I'm responding to your direction, but I am attending to that. And I think that could make or break an experience for someone in terms of the results that they see.
Oh, absolutely.
If they are able to attend and be active while, like, it's not a passive experience. Healing is not a passive experience.
Amen, sister. Amen. It's true. One of the coolest things about being able to do a session with you was how much you brought to the table, literally. There are some clients that I work with who haven't been on this kind of path, and really don't have any idea of what internal movement might be. And that's a very different process. So for us, it was fun because we got to start on stage 15.
Wow, I feel so flattered. Thank you.
Yeah, well, it's really fun. I mean, so much of it is getting a chance to ride with a horse who's had a lot of training, and it has who has the languaging that they need to interact with a human being versus a horse that's never really worked with a person before. It's like that their skill makes a huge difference in what possible outcomes are available.
Yeah. One of the thoughts that I had while you were speaking was that there are times when, at least in my experience, there are times when mobility is the goal, but it can go too far. I think I talked about this with you when I had my session, but I have a history of my ribs going out of place. And I'm like, not the greatest.
Yeah. Oh man.
It's something that people don't really realize how much mobility there is in the body, or the potential for mobility there is in the body. And the ribs are a little easier because you watch CPR videos or whatever, and you see there's a lot of flex, there's a lot of mobility in the rib cage, even if it is providing a good amount of structure and protection for some organs, just some important ones. But there are so many other parts of our body that get neglected with movement, and I would maybe say I haven't done a lot of thinking about trying to keep those parts of my rib cage mobile because of my history with having it be a little too mobile. But I'm sure that I've had conversations with you about how people don't think about mobility between certain joints, and there are parts of the body that get neglected. And of course we always see major injuries of knees and backs and ankles and things like that, but there's a whole lot of body here. And how many bones are there in the body?
I want to say
it changes from person to person a little bit.
Well, on person to person, but also on age. We're born with more bones, and they steadily fuse together. Over time. I forget what I think it's saying mid-20s, 260 bones.
Yeah, and I think infants are born with 308 or something like that.
That sounds about right.
So that's a pretty big decrease in number. We fuse a lot.
And then you think about all the joints. One bone might have 4 or 5 different joints. And needs the ability to shift in relationship to all these different other aspects. That I think is part of our resilience. So even with a rib issue, one of the things I'm looking at is if that rib keeps going out, it can in a sense be hypermobile, but why is it hypermobile? Most likely because multiple other joints around it don't have mobility, so it's the only place in that system that can move, and the system needs to move. So rather than having 1 degree of movement in all these places, there's 12 degrees in one place.
Yeah.
And then
That's a really good point. I have thought more about mobility with the more conversations that we've had over the last couple of months, and with dancing, of course. And I've been trying to be really aware of that as a teacher and an instructor, being oh, okay, all of these people are under my care. I'm I need to be aware of everything that I've learned about the body and make sure that I'm providing the best that I can. But there's, I don't know, in a way that's a little scary, thinking about that if you have a one bone with multiple joints, that almost tells me that there's maybe this is a fear thing, that there are that many more ways to injure yourself. I think it might be a fear issue in my mind.
You know, someday I'm going to write a memoir. I think I'm going to call it 1,001 Ways to Hurt Yourself. Mostly just recounting all the different stories I've heard of injuries. It can be overwhelming, I would say. And that's where we get our resilience from. It's like you look at a trampoline and it's not resilient enough for an adult to bounce on it because it's made out of one piece. It's all, I don't know how many, hundreds of springs along the edge, and like who knows how many thousands of individual fibers that are all woven together that create that resilience. And I feel like that's the ideal within our human body, is all these parts and pieces and all those joints. Like one bone can have those multiple joints, so it has so many options for strain to travel through and disperse
rather than injure it. That's much more positive way to think about it. Yeah.
And so really that's like one of my favorite things, an assessment that I use often, and maybe I use this with you, is just to give a little pulse into the body to send a wave through the system. And in a really resilient system, it feels as if it is one form that a wave can transmit through easily. It has that trampoline feeling to it. But if I do that and I feel it hitting like a point and it doesn't go any further than that, it's like, oh, where that wave stops, one is tells me about where a really great place to work is, and one is that's the place that'll get injured. Like that strain will hit that point, and instead of diffusing through the system, it hits that point. That's when injuries occur.
That is so helpful to think about. Just because like I am a backpacker as well, and that is something I've done a lot of work the last 6 months of injury proofing my ankles and my knees, and because I have a ankle injury that I'm still working on, and so I've focused on that so much, but thinking about not so much as like almost guarding in those places, but learning to figure out how your body needs to release so that how did you call it? Force? What did you call it exactly? I don't know. Doesn't matter. So that it's dispersed strain.
Yeah.
Because, oh man, you've got me thinking.
It's, and as a backpacker, like, for instance, you wouldn't want a backpack hanging off your neck.
Nope.
Because the strain is too acute. Like, everything about a good backpack is designed to spread the strain over as large of a surface area as possible. And
and then you can have other things like trekking poles to help even take that even further. Backpacking, I mean, it's there's just so much there in the terms of like when you're packing, packing your pack, your heavy items, where do you put your heavy items? As low as possible, right? And close to the back.
And as close to the back as possible. So in that sense, you're looking to get the heaviest weight as close to your center as possible, because the farther away from the center it is, the more energy it's going to take to move, and the more leverage it has to pull you around.
Yeah, absolutely. Like it's much harder to stabilize, which when you're moving a lot of weight, you're trying to be as stable as possible in doing so. And if it's all out of whack, then you get, like you said, it pulls you around. And that's just, thinking about that freaks me out a little bit. I'm like, you're just setting yourself up for injury,
Oh, like a poorly
a poorly packed, like a poorly balanced pack, and with that, not knowing how to use your body to like work with what you're carrying, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's one of the things that that is, I think, sets so many of us, especially in this Western culture, up for future difficulties is the priority in education is, I would say, primarily on language, like to get a kid talking as quickly as possible, to get them in shoes as quickly as possible, to get them standing as quickly as possible, without letting those processes accumulate in a natural way.
Mm-hmm.
And you watch a little toddler like squat down to pick something off the floor, and it's like, that
It was a good squat.
That was well done.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then, unfortunately, often parents are like, no, you need to sit in a chair. And try to skip those stages. And it's all of a sudden like, learning to, we kind of we can become very caged in terms of our ability to move, partly because of the focuses of how movement is taught and in our culture.
Mm-hmm.
Like,
yeah.
Hey, I think about it quite a lot.
I would hope so.
Because little kiddos is like, oh man, before they're forced to adapt, like shoes.
Yeah.
You've gone more and more barefoot.
I have. And it has changed a lot about how I move. Not only in my gait, but the ease with which I move. Like, things start to flow a little bit better when you're not putting yourself on these hard structures. And it's interesting. But with the kids aspect, I have a niece who has a twin niece. And her and her sister both have these adorable little Crocs. And the one in particular that I'm thinking of, her name is Olive. And she refuses to wear shoes. And thinking about watching them, in my experience, I'm like, oh yeah, I've seen her do that perfect squat and sit down from that squat and then go back into squat to stand up. I'm like, this person is never just like bending over to pick something up, you know. I was like, like that chef's kiss, kind of like, that was beautiful. And it's fascinating to watch so many forms of life do things really well. It's always wonderful to see them do well.
It's beautiful. And to me, it kind of builds faith. Like, Olive wasn't taught how to do that. Mm-hmm. Like, it's in there.
Yeah.
It's in there. If we don't bury it. But I have to say, in 15 years of practice, I have never... Is this true? I don't know. It might be. It's pretty close. I've never worked with a person who could squat like that in adulthood and had low back pain.
Hot tip.
Maintaining the ability to squat efficiently, like a baby, is revolutionary.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think my experience with you and through this conversation is that much of your learning about movement comes from watching life of many beings, like animals and humans alike. Mm-hmm. And you were telling me earlier about cats. Oh, we both are cat people. And one of the tips that you had for me before we started, and I would love for you to share, is the yawn and stretch of a cat.
Well, and that's a good call because I need it right now from sitting in this chair for so long.
Yeah.
It's not my normal mode, but yeah, that idea that we need multiple postures to survive in the world, and cats do this so well, but after sitting static for a little bit,
That did feel good. I needed to yawn.
Oh yeah, I feel better. That was good. In science, they call that pandiculation, which is a primarily unconscious, parasympathetic nervous system response, and so animals do it very naturally. They don't overthink it.
Yeah, they can come down into that.
And I would say one of the fascinating things about working with horses is, and this is another thing that taught me quite a lot in my work, which falls under the heading of pause often. One change with a horse, you can move one thing, get it done, and then give them space. Have you ever seen a horse yawn before?
I have not.
Oh my gosh. Go straight to YouTube. They have the goofiest looking yawn of all times. Like, cats make it look like
Elegant and fierce.
elegant and fierce. Thank you. Horses, oh my god, their tongue sticks out about like 6 inches. These big old buck teeth come out. Their eyeballs roll back. Their ears, and oh man, yeah. If you haven't seen a horse yawn, it'll make your day. And then they're ready for a new piece of work. That for them, they will almost always yawn, and their nervous system resets, and then off they go. And that ability for it to reset the nervous system, I think, is huge for us as, I would say, aspiring animals.
Yes. Absolutely. Yeah, that's so interesting. I wonder what it is about the yawn. Like, if it's like working on a vagus nerve or something, if there's something more about it, or if it's just like breath, and combination with easeful movement.
Oh yeah, that was a good one. Those are really good questions, and I hope you continue to research that.
Yeah, I think it could be fun to explore.
I think there's a lot in terms of most of your cranial nerves come out of right about here, and the vagus nerve is a cranial nerve. Yeah. In the sense that it comes out of the brain straight and not the spinal cord. So, I mean, it has to be connected. Like a good yawn, really.
Yeah, and probably not only that one. Like if they're mostly coming out in this zone, just that action and the tension and release of that is probably like physically acting on this. And one of the things that I have learned through coaching is a couple of different methods of how to relax the like neck and shoulders and the face. And part of that is like this like just temporary kind of isometric clench of the jaw, just really short, and then like release and do it again and release and just do that a few times, which I try to be mindful of teeth when I do that. Not everybody has the best teeth for such things, as long as you're not applying too much force. But
we need to find some twigs.
Yeah, or a good piece of leather, So.
And that's a really useful technique that works everywhere. Like shoulders are tense, and you can't untense them. Take them fully into flexion.
Yeah, and then just let it out.
And it's so huge. Part of that is and this has to our body is always, they call it often base tonus. Like our muscles are never fully relaxed. One of my, I don't know, favorite educational jokes is the idea that if you really, really want to get flexible, the fastest and easiest way is to go have somebody put you under anesthesia.
I believe it.
Because that is really the only time where you lose all tonus. Other than that, your body is always under a certain amount of tonus, and for very good reason, to protect your body. And I find it very interesting in that sense that when you take something fully into flexion, it typically reminds the body that its base tonus is lower than where you were. And super big tool.
Yeah, and you see that like clenching used in like yoga nidra or like body scanning kind of thing, where you might scan everything, but then you try to do this like whole body tense and then relax it all out. And there's lots of ways to use that. People probably don't utilize it enough. Like it's such an easy thing that you can just do.
Yeah, and it's so fascinating because that's, I don't know if you've ever had your hands on a cat when they did that primary stretch.
I have.
Have you noticed how they like get super rigid?
Yeah.
And then let it go? I'm like, don't have much to teach you, do I?
Yeah.
But yeah, I would say that observing life process, principle of Taoism, it's like nature, it already knows what to do. I feel like being human, we have to figure it out.
Yeah.
And I would say that's been my primary quest. Like, growing up very confused about what it was to be human, and even my practice and all the things I've done is part of that quest on like, if and when I do have a kid, I'd like to learn as much as possible so that I can help them, so that they don't have to struggle.
Do everything.
Yeah, struggle as much as I did on the quest of being human.
Well, I'm grateful to know you and know that you have done all of this struggle and you're willing to share it with other people, because Jack's talked a lot about like, when and if we ever have a kid, we have to get him into Ben. Because he's done a lot of thinking and learning about how like development through childhood and how important it is to have everything mobile and aligned for functional life, like all of the rest of the life, It starts young in that baby squat, right? We got to keep that going.
Yeah. I'm in such awe of pregnancy and even the birthing process, because in a lot of ways, that was our first trauma. And our development, the trajectory of our development that's the first big shift. I mean, even so far as like, does the little baby turn its head to this way, or does it turn its head to this way as it works its way through the vaginal canal? Is it able to nudge just a little bit to make that movement? And even how like different people experience their lives who have had a cesarean where they didn't have that initial
challenge.
I would almost go so far as to call it an initiatory process. Like one of the things I've noticed with cesarean babies is they often have a hard time sitting up. Like they'll tend to just like...
Because they didn't have to work to get out?
Yeah. I suspect, and this is something I would like to learn more about, but like that initial nudging movement like starts the nervous system, starts this movement of extension out through the crown. And that initial extension will be utilized in all sorts of different parts of the process, but that's when it initiates. And so I've worked with other practitioners who spent a lot of time simply like in child's pose with your knees up on the chest and just like nudging the floor with their forehead to initiate that sequence. Yeah.
There's so many cool things that we can do.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah. Well, this has been very educational. I don't know if you want to play an outro. You're welcome to, but not obligated. And I'm really glad that you got to come over and have some tea and have this wonderful conversation. I've gotten to learn much more. It's always wonderful.
Absolutely. I think we should have a closing outro.
Okay. I'm excited.
We'll close as we began.
Thanks, Ben.